Every year, millions of worn rubber tires are stripped from road trains, utes, and family sedans across the continent, leaving behind an inescapable mountain of toxic waste. By the 1970s, paddocks were overflowing with black, rotting rubber. They bred relentless swarms of mosquitoes, caught fire under the blistering sun, and choked rural tips with no viable recycling market anywhere in sight. Then, a proposal emerged that sounded like an engineering masterstroke. Take 2 million discarded tires, bind them together, and sink them directly offshore onto the ocean floor to build a flourishing artificial reef. It was hailed as visionary. State authorities granted full statutory approvals, coastal councils cheered, and prominent marine researchers backed the venture with absolute confidence. The premise was deceptively simple. Natural reefs cover less than 1% of the seafloor, yet they shelter a quarter of all known marine life. Free-drifting coral polyps desperately need hard substrate to establish colonies, and providing that footprint was supposed to bootstrap an entire marine habitat from what was essentially landfill. On paper, it seemed flawless. An armada of more than 100 private runabouts and fishing trawlers rallied off the coast in an atmosphere of patriotic celebration. Supported by corporate giants who even dropped ceremonial golden tires into the ocean, volunteers banded the tires into massive bundles with standard steel fasteners and nylon straps, dumping them across roughly 15 hectares of sandy seabed, just a couple of kilometers off the coastline. The public believed they were engineering a permanent marine sanctuary. Yet beneath that wave of optimism lurked a catastrophic failure of basic materials science. Nobody treated the carbon steel fasteners to withstand the harsh realities of warm, highly oxygenated saltwater. In an unforgiving marine environment packed with dissolved chloride ions, electrochemical corrosion runs at breakneck speed. Rust is an aggressive electrical reaction, stripping electrons from raw iron until the integrity of the metal fails completely. Within a few short seasons, the bindings gave out. Instead of a solid, enduring habitat, millions of loose, buoyant rubber projectiles were set adrift, directly in the path of ferocious tropical cyclones and heavy winter swells. When the first monster low-pressure system barreled down the coastline, the seabed became a violent battleground. Immense underwater surges lifted the free tires, transforming the failed dump into a relentless underwater avalanche that smashed directly into ancient living coral formations nearby. Rather than generating new life, this government-sanctioned creation became a mechanical wrecking ball, pulverizing decades of delicate reef into lifeless rubble. To comprehend how such a colossal ecological blunder was sanctioned, one must look at the regulatory landscape of the late 20th century. For generations, the vast marine expanse was treated as an infinite, out-of-sight dumping ground. If an industrial plant, a smelter, or a municipal depot generated unmanageable waste, the deep water was expected to swallow it whole without consequence. Coastal waters absorbed millions of tons of raw sewage, dredging sludge, and toxic industrial runoff every single year. Between the late 40s and the 70s, tens of thousands of steel drums containing lethal, low-level radioactive waste were quietly rolled off barges into deep ocean trenches, some even punctured with high-powered rifles when they refused to sink beneath the swell dot. Against that backdrop of unchecked environmental neglect, dumping clean rubber tires into the sea did not look like an ecological gamble. To the authorities of the day, it was presented as an innovative conservation breakthrough. When stricter marine pollution legislation finally closed the door on open ocean dumping, landholders and municipal tips were left with colossal stockpiles of unrecyclable rubber. Discarded tires were an absolute liability on the land. Spontaneous tire fires blanketed regional townships in suffocating black smoke for weeks, and stagnant rainwater trapped in the rims created ideal breeding grounds for relentless swarms of disease-carrying mosquitoes. When a passionate regional nonprofit proposed solving two crises with a single stroke, clearing rural tips and using the salvaged rubber to construct an artificial reef system, the idea captured the imagination of regulators and the public alike. The logic appeared unshakable. Sunken iron shipwrecks and massive concrete tetrapods had successfully nurtured rich benthic communities in other coastal zones. The assumption was that rubber would behave identically, offering a barren, sandy expanse the firm foundation needed for encrusting organisms to establish a vibrant ecological nursery. No one anticipated the devastating mechanical physics that unfolded once the marine environment went to work on the site. Coral polyps are remarkably fragile organisms, requiring years of absolute, undisturbed stability to cement their calcium carbonate skeletons to a substrate. But a submerged tire is neither heavy enough to anchor itself against massive underwater ground swells, nor porous enough to encourage biological adhesion. As the structural steel clips dissolved in the brine, the entire grid disintegrated into a mobile, abrasive plague. With every passing monsoon trough and powerful ocean swell, millions of loose tires were swept across the ocean floor like a slow-motion subterranean bulldozing crew. Instead of nurturing life, this mobile field of industrial debris scraped bare every square meter of seabed it encountered, scouring away precious seagrass meadows, tearing soft corals from the rock, and leaving a scarred underwater wasteland in its wake. The scale of the destruction refused to stay neatly confined to the original 15-hectare boundary. In the wild, high-energy waters along the coast, heavy swells generated by severe tropical lows and southerly busters tore into the loose field of rubber with catastrophic force. Currents transformed the 2 million untethered tires into a sprawling, migratory field of debris. They were propelled hundreds of kilometers along the continental shelf, completely bypassing state boundaries and jurisdiction lines. Coastal shires and regional councils that had played absolutely no role in the original stunt suddenly found thousands of barnacle-encrusted tires washing up along their pristine tourist beaches, remote headlands, and protected mangrove estuaries. The sheer biological irony was staggering. A mobile, rolling tire cannot sustain a benthic ecosystem. Even if pioneer algae or encrusting sponges manage to secure a temporary foothold during calm weather, the very next surge flips the tire, smothering the juvenile growth in the sand and grinding the organisms against the seabed. Instead of a thriving nursery, the deposit became an ecological trap, drawing in nomadic fish species only to offer zero permanent sanctuary, zero harvestable food web, and constant structural instability. By the early 2000s, state fisheries agencies and environmental protection authorities were forced to confront an undeniable disaster. The site had degraded into a massive industrial tip, sitting directly offshore, actively menacing adjacent marine parks. The conversation abruptly shifted from misplaced civic pride to an unprecedented logistical salvage nightmare. The first targeted recovery mission, led by university research teams operating on shoestring government grants, managed to haul up just over 1,000 tires after months of backbreaking, hazardous work. Divers had to descend through treacherous currents, wrestling silt-choked, waterlogged casings out of the sand by hand before winching them to support barges. The initial economic projections were sobering. Full remediation of the seabed was calculated to cost anywhere between $60 and $150 million, a staggering liability that state budgets simply refused to absorb. With bureaucratic inertia stalling every proposal, the operation required unconventional muscle. Defense forces were called in, treating the sunken wasteland as an active tactical salvage and underwater warfare training ground. Navy clearance divers plunged into the murky depths for months on end, slinging heavy-duty cables around clustered debris and hoisting tens of thousands of tires to the surface. Yet, despite years of intensive military drill and commercial salvage contracts, they barely scratched the surface, leaving more than 1 million tires still grinding away at the seabed. As the colossal scale of the cleanup became painfully obvious, the void left by cash-strapped government bodies was rapidly filled by private enterprise. Cleantech startups, venture-backed environmental ventures, and commercial salvagers arrived on the scene, promising to turn a national embarrassment into an inspiring blueprint for the circular economy. Their business model was modern and heavily polished. Extract the sunken rubber, process it into designer wristbands and lifestyle merchandise, and sell those branded tokens online to fund further extraction. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate triumph of modern eco-capitalism, turning toxic offshore refuse into clean, consumer-funded ecological action. Yet when independent analysts and marine economists scrutinized the balance sheets, a deeply uncomfortable disparity came to light. The early university-led recovery campaigns had operated with Spartan efficiency, hauling tires from the seabed at a baseline cost of roughly $25 to $30 per unit. Under the glossy banner of corporate-sponsored salvage, the operational expenditure ballooned astronomically. Millions of dollars poured in through viral crowdfunding and premium merchandising, but the actual rate of extraction lagged far behind the relentless marketing narrative. It raised a bitter point of friction among local fishing communities and marine biologists. Was the ocean floor truly being restored? Or had it simply become the cinematic backdrop for a highly lucrative private enterprise? The deeper moral hazard lay in the deafening silence of the original polluters. The multinational tire manufacturing conglomerates that had once enthusiastically funded the drop, posing for coastal ribbon cuttings and claiming generous corporate tax write-offs, had completely walked away from the wreckage. By outsourcing the disaster to community goodwill and private charity, the corporate balance sheets remained untouched. Sinking millions of unwanted tires beneath the surf had effectively allowed the industry to externalize an unmanageable land-based disposal crisis onto the public commons. This arrangement exposed a perverse economic architecture. If retrieving legacy industrial contamination can be monetized into a sustainable, highly profitable business model, the economic imperative to prevent systemic pollution in the first place evaporates entirely. Society creates a marketplace where corporate giants are quietly absolved of the responsibility to handle their own waste, while private operators reap substantial margins sanitizing the fallout. It transforms an ongoing environmental catastrophe from an urgent regulatory crime into an endless, self-sustaining financial asset. The tragic legacy of the rubber reef was far from an isolated incident. Across the globe, the seductively cheap illusion of dumping industrial detritus under the guise of marine regeneration was repeated with stubborn persistence. In the Mediterranean, thousands of vehicle tires were submerged along premier tourist coastlines, with identical promises of marine revival, only for marine scientists decades later to detect heavy metals and toxic petrochemical additives leaching directly into the surrounding water column, poisoning the benthic food chain from the bottom up. Everywhere the pattern reemerged, the core mechanics remained unchanged. Whenever society generates a colossal surplus of hazardous or expensive waste, be it unrecyclable vulcanized rubber, obsolete industrial concrete, or decommissioned naval warships laden with carcinogenic chemical wiring, the temptation to rebrand dumping as an act of ocean stewardship proves almost irresistible. By pitching these projects as artificial habitats, polluters successfully dodge the immense costs of onshore remediation. If the structure takes hold, authorities boast of engineering progress. If it disintegrates and scours the seabed into an underwater desert, the consequences simply vanish beneath the rolling swell. Yet, as the relentless salvage cranes and clearance divers slowly stripped the migrating fields of rubber from the seabed, an extraordinary transformation began to take place. The moment the abrasive mechanical scouring stopped, the ocean floor revealed its astonishing capacity for natural regeneration. Without thousands of heavy tires grinding across the sand with every passing southerly gale, the substrate finally stabilized. Microscopic larvae drifting through the coastal currents were no longer instantly crushed against moving rubber. Hardy, pioneering sponges and calcareous coralline algae established the very first stable crust over the exposed limestone bedrock. Within seasons, vital ribbons of native seagrass rooted deeply into the consolidated sediment, binding the shifting banks and creating critical nursery grounds. Schools of juvenile flathead, trevally, and bream flooded back into the quiet shallows, seeking shelter among the returning canopy. The marine ecosystem did not require our discarded industrial refuse to manufacture life. It simply needed the destructive human interference dragged out of its waters, so its ancient, resilient biology could do what it has done for millions of years. The lingering tragedy of the Osborne Reef is not merely a technical post-mortem on cheap, corroding steel. It is an enduring lesson in human hubris, and our habit of inventing high-minded ecological excuses for our cheapest impulses. For half a century, an entire coastline paid the price for a convenient shortcut. We wanted to believe that our industrial detritus could simply be rolled off a barge and miraculously transformed into a vibrant underwater metropolis, as though nature were an eager subcontractor ready to process our mountains of discarded junk without consequence. Modern marine science has long dismantled that self-serving myth. Rigorous research demonstrates that many artificial reef ventures do not actually foster new biomass or regenerate depleted fisheries at all. They simply function as giant aggregation magnets. They gather pelagic schools and solitary predators from healthy, surrounding habitats into one predictable concentrated zone where commercial dropliners and recreational boats can effortlessly haul them out of the water. We did not build a self-sustaining ecosystem. We merely engineered a more efficient, industrialized fish trap. The natural marine world is neither a helpless victim waiting for our consumer waste to rescue it, nor a bottomless sink capable of absorbing our toxic refuse indefinitely. When given the space and undisturbed isolation it demands, the seafloor recovers through its own rugged, ancient momentum. The true work of conservation is rarely found in grand corporate photo opportunities, high-tech salvage ventures, or designer merchandise made from ocean plastic. It lies in the unglamorous, uncompromising discipline of taking full responsibility for what we manufacture on land, refusing to hide our toxic liabilities beneath the rolling blue horizon. The greatest risk to our coastal waters is not a single project that fails through poor engineering. The real danger is creating an economic landscape where cleaning up catastrophic environmental mismanagement becomes more lucrative than preventing the disaster in the first place. When pollution is turned into a viable commodity and disposal is conveniently framed as environmental stewardship, we guarantee that the next disaster is already being drafted in a boardroom. If unraveling these forgotten ecological crises and confronting the uncomfortable mechanics behind human ambition resonates with you, consider subscribing. We will continue pulling back the curtain on the untold histories, regulatory blind spots, and industrial blunders that shaped our fragile coastal ecosystems. Until next time.